Okay, I think we're ready to get started. Welcome everyone to another Global Friday. This is the last Global Friday for the fall semester. And I'm very happy today to welcome a couple of presenters who are going to be talking about the situation in China. Very interesting topic these days. I'd like to start by acknowledging that we are gathered today on the traditional and unceded territory of the Clay Tenay, and I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to live and work in this territory. So this presentation today is the result mainly of our partnership with the Canadian International Council and the Prince George chapter of the Canadian International Council. And I'm going to invite Sean Simmons up momentarily to introduce our speakers. But I just wanted to say how much we value this partnership. We've had a number of really great presentations over the fall semester and in the past, and it's just been a really wonderful experience. So thank you, Sean, for your ongoing collaboration, and we look forward to pursuing that collaboration further in the future. So I'll pass that over to you.
Greatly appreciated, Gary. Yes, and thank you. Welcome everyone here in person in Prince George and everyone online. I'm really excited today to bring you an interesting conversation where we're both having Phil Calvert present here in Prince George, as well as Joanna Chiu presenting online. A special call out today to Gary Wilson and to Jacqueline Haller, both from UNBC. Jacqueline's our membership chair at CIC as well. And as Gary was saying, this is a really interesting partnership where we're able to bring in speakers of high caliber from around Canada talking about international issues. A little bit about Canadian International Council for those who haven't had a chance to hear about us before. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization dedicated to international issues from a Canadian perspective. We have been around since 1928, founded by former Prime Minister Sir Robert Borden, and we have 19 branches across the country. And the two most recent branches are out west, so we're really punching above our weight out here. Prince George has been around, I guess, this year 3, and Whitehorse has just announced a branch. So I guess the final thing I'll say is more to the university students. Really, university students and faculty form a really important part of CIC. And so for students who are interested in being part of CIC, please reach out. We've got some special programs. Jacqueline Haller has been able to provide some really great assistance to get students on board. So for today's talk, we have, as mentioned, 2 excellent speakers. The way this is going to work is we'll give each speaker about 15 or 20 minutes to make an introduction, starting with Phil Calvert and then Joanna. And then what we'll do is we'll open it up for questions. And the idea is to have a sort of an interaction both here in person, questions from the audience here, as well as online. I'll be moderating the online questions. And if anyone online wants to pose a question, please add it to the Q&A box on Zoom. And without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker. Phil Calvert grew up here in Prince George and is a graduate of Prince George Senior Secondary School, which I was corrected on yesterday. He spent 34 years in Canada's Foreign Service with 3 postings in Beijing, including as Deputy Ambassador, as well as an assignment as Ambassador to Cambodia, Thailand, and Laos. In Global Affairs Canada, he was Director General for North Asia, Director in the Trade Policy Branch, and Deputy Chief Negotiator for China's accession to the World Trade Organization. Welcome, Phil. Right now? Oh, sure. No, well, I'll introduce her after you.
Okay, all right. Thank you. Okay, thank you, Sean, and thanks to the CIC. Am I on? There we are. Thanks to the CIC for bringing me up here. Thanks to UNBC for hosting us here. And so what I thought I'd do is first of all start my timer because I don't want to go over time. And the way we're going to do this, it's really, first of all, it's an honor here also to be here with Joanna Chiu, whose book, China Unbound, is really a great read. And Sean will talk more about her when he introduces her. Well, I thought when Sean and I were talking about this originally, we thought we'd have this discussion about the 20th Party Congress of the 20th Congress of the Chinese Communist Party, which took place in October, and we'd focus on that and what it means for Canada, and that's the title. But as you know, there's so much has happened between mid-October and now in China that we're going to have, I think, a broader discussion. I'm going to start off with talking about the Party Congress and just a few takeaways from that, and what I think it means, a little bit about maybe what Canada, I'm suggestions for what Canada might be doing, and then Joanna is we'll turn it over to Joanna. So just here's, I'll start my timer. Don't forget to do this. Why is this important? The Chinese Communist Party has in Congress every 5 years. And it's important because the Communist Party in China is essentially the most powerful organization. It runs policy, it drives everything. It's the Chinese party representative in any organization is the most important. And it also, of course, is in charge of the military. The military doesn't report to the government. So the Communist Party drives policy there at the senior levels. Party members are also government leaders, but it's really the Communist Party that is the true locus of power in China. So this meeting that took place is one of the ones that takes place every 5 years. And usually what happens is there's a kind of directions given about policy, a long speech by the General Secretary, many meetings, of course, over the course of the week, and an announcement of a leadership lineup. So this year it was particularly noteworthy for a couple of reasons. Xi Jinping, who is, of course, president of China and also head of the military commission, received his third term as general secretary of the party. Now, this has been touted as being unprecedented, and we saw this a lot. This is an unprecedented development, but actually it's not. There have been many leaders in China. The tendency has been for many leaders, the top leaders of the party in China, to stick around for a long time. Like, for example, Mao, who was around for many decades. In fact, there's been a lot of instability in terms of how long the leader of the party stays on. After Mao died, and after his successor was pushed out, they actually abolished the term of party chairman and reinstated the party general secretary. Even those terms have not been consistent. In fact, the only person who actually served for just 10 years and 2 terms, 10 years as party secretary was predecessor, Xi Jinping's predecessor, Hu Jintao. So, but what it does do, what this third term does mean, it's one of the many ways in which Xi Jinping is walking away from some of the norms of behavior that have been established under Deng Xiaoping. This idea of having a regular rotation of leaders serving only 2 terms, and then and having a collective leadership, a clear succession plan, so you knew who was going to be the next leader of the Communist Party. This was developed by Mao and others in the late 80s late 80s, essentially early 90s. The idea being that the experience of a cultural revolution with Mao as this ultimate leader, tremendous factional fights underneath him, struggles for succession, very deadly struggles about who's going to succeed him. He thought this was very unstable. He also thought it was unstable not to have a collective leadership. In other words, to have people from different factions in the leadership. The top leadership should consist of people from different factions so that there's kind of a balancing of power interests. So we see now that Xi Jinping has a third term. He has basically abandoned collective leadership. All the people in all the top 7 members of our Politburo, the top 6 plus him, they're all loyalists, loyal to him. You may see them split up later on, but right now this is what it stands. And to me, this reflects a bit of instability. This is an unstable situation. As I said, when Mao was chairman, there was a lot of instability at the leadership level. So this undermines some of the reforms and the directions that have been taken in China in the last 3 decades. There's also another thing that Deng objected to was this idea of a cult of leadership. Mao had this cult following, and he thought this was again very dangerous to have this absolute loyalty and all this veneration, such high veneration of these leaders, and so he tried to move away from that. But we see again attempts to create and to build even further a cult of Xi Jinping. Although interestingly, he didn't get everything he wanted this time at the Party Congress. He wanted to become the chairman of the party, like Mao, regain that title, and that didn't happen. So, so this creates a lot of concerns in terms of China's governance, at least in my mind. One-man rule, I think, again, is unstable. And the danger of having Xi Jinping in an echo chamber where he's not getting criticisms of his behaviors, of his policies, means, I think, that it will be, again, you're liable to have more dangerous or bad policies, like zero COVID, which is, as we see now, creating a great deal of pushback in China. And I think a leadership, like increasing disconnect from the rest of China as you make these policies. And of course, no clear institutional successor. So that makes for instability. So that's one takeaway from that. Two more I want to talk about is, one is in the General Secretary's report, which is the General Secretary's report that it's always been, and he gives at the Congress, is a long, kind of like a long throne speech full of a lot of arcane language, but it's also like code. It sends messages about challenges as well as messages about objectives. And so since this Congress came at a time of when China was facing a lot of domestic challenges, youth urban unemployment, the real estate sector, challenges in the real estate sector, economic growth declining or not reaching the levels of economic growth in the past, and so on. Also, more international hostility to China. This speech was given in the context of these challenges that China is facing. And what comes out of this are two things that I think I wanted to mention. One is this doubling down on ideology. I think more than previous recent leaders, Xi Jinping actually believes more in Marxism-Leninism as this driving force that's going to, be the basis of decisions. It's going to push China ahead. And this is an important way in which you organize and manage and set your priorities. So, and this is important, I think, because over the past 30 years, while belief in Marxism-Leninism amongst general populace has declined significantly, the driving force for party legitimacy has been economic growth and the prospects for a better future. Now, economic growth is a challenge in China, and we have all these other economic challenges as well. So I think this is an attempt to maybe reinstate ideology as a source of party legitimacy, and I think it's going to be unsuccessful. The speech also talks about nationalism, national rejuvenation, and populism, common prosperity, which means sort of on the one hand making China a great and glorious power in the world, and also redistributing income, reducing the income gap in China. All this is really significant in terms of policy. And also focusing on the party as an economic player and the state, more state-driven economy, less role of market forces, I think is what we'd be seeing. And that has implications for those who want to do trade in China and invest there. And finally, I want to also think another takeaway about this is that Xi Jinping himself, I think there's an undercurrent in the tone of the speech of worry. Of course, he talks about a struggle. We have to have we have to struggle, and it's even more of an emphasis on struggle, the challenges we're facing. It's a bit less triumphal and a little more concerned about how to move China ahead, if you read the undercurrents. And this is when you get into sort of how you read these speeches, because nowhere is someone going to say we have a real problem with, say, youth unemployment, which they do. But what the speech says is we're going to focus on unemployment, which means we have a problem. We're going to focus on innovation, which means that, as we know, the China-US relations are in a difficult place right now, and there's been curtailment of exports of US produced microchips to China. So this is, and China doesn't have the capacity to make the same of the same quality. So this is, forces and driving innovation. The government will drive innovation. These sorts of statements. And again, the COVID itself is mentioned as a struggle. We are struggling, which really means like we've really got a big problem. So when you read these coded language, you realize that China faces these domestic issues, domestic challenges, and it also mentions Taiwan too. Taiwan being, on the mind of leadership. So unification with Taiwan, of course, comes and is part of his speech. He also mentions that we're not going to rule out, unification by force, which is a clear signal about China's intentions, I think. And also, of course, the speech talks about China's role, as I said, a role in the world and its capacity to address the international system and things that are unfair about the international system. In other words, remolding China's image. Joanna knows a lot more about that than I do, so I'm not going to dwell on that. So finally, I want to just make a couple of points about what I think Canada should be doing about this in the few minutes that are remaining to me, and then we'll pass it on to Joanna. One of the things Canada has mentioned in its Indo-Pacific strategy is this: we're having a tougher approach on China. We're going to focus more on kind of defensive issues and preserving, protecting Canadians. We're going to, and the common theme is that we're going to, on the one hand, confront China in areas where it runs up against our international interests, our domestic interests, on human rights issues, things that run up against our values. And on the other hand, we're going to cooperate with China globally on issues of common concern. But that's the aim. Of course, it takes China to agree to this as well in terms of the international cooperation, and that is one element that Canada will have to address. If we want to effectively, if Canada really wants effectively to address both the challenges and and find ways to cooperate with China, it really has to engage at the senior leadership levels. One of the things I'm saying is that Canada now has to re-engage with China in dialogue. It has to start, at the top with because of the top leadership. There'll be a new premier, Li Qiang, who is number 2 in the party, will become premier in March. So that would be the Prime Minister Trudeau's counterpart. Engage with him. Start these dialogues through the system. And it's not that we're forgetting about the two Michaels or that we're forgetting about the dark side of China's behavior. What it is that the reality is that Canada has a $115 billion trade relationship with China, that there are, I've got 3 minutes, that there are these global concerns we have to address, and you're not going to be able to address them if you don't address them as a part of a coherent approach to the whole relationship. You're not going to effectively deal with your concerns about human rights or China's international behavior by one-offs where the Prime Minister catches Xi Jinping on the way to the bathroom and raises a concern about election interference. It has to be part of a coherent, broad-based dialogue, and so it's important for Canada to reestablish that. It also, I think, would be important, given the signals about Taiwan, for Canada to be engaged in a careful and considered expansion of its connections with Taiwan, perhaps more economically focused, because that is less thorny or less difficult. And I would recommend, for example, a clear invitation that Canada would welcome Taiwan's participation in the CPTPP, the trade agreement, comprehensive and progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. I keep forgetting the name. That we will welcome that. Make a clear signal on that. The agreement is designed to allow non-states to be part of it, and so because it allows for separate customs territories, so Taiwan could participate in this with the same status as it has in, for example, World Trade Organization. And 2 more points I'd like to make. Canada should really focus more on coherence. That when we deal with China, we have similar messages from the federal government on common issues, from the provincial government, that we're sending the same message. And to me, we really have undermined ourselves sometimes. Most recently, when the 2 Michaels, when they were still in prison, we had the Premier of Nova Scotia going to China and not mentioning it not mentioning these two Canadians in prison because really that's a federal issue, you know, and I got business to do. That's just, you know, that's just unacceptable. And finally, understanding or comprehension. If we really want to have an effective engagement with China, if we really want to be effectively as a country understand engagement with China and understand what this new situation means with Hu Jintao and the leadership and what this implications this has, then we have to have people who understand, more people who understand China more in government, in private sector, and across the board, because that's the only way we're going to have an effective way of addressing our interests. And so this comes back to universities and UNBC. You know, I think there's a real need for more China programs, for more programs that bring China specialists, people studying China into internship programs in private sector or in embassies, which we have, but which really needs to be beefed up. So finally, I just want to say, I think we're at a crossroads with our respect to relations, with China. We always say we're at a crossroads, but really, I think we are this time. What we need is a very realistic and informed and balanced policy. I think Canada's trying to do this with the Indo-Pacific strategy. We'll see how it works out, but it really needs to invest in time, it needs to invest in effort, it needs to invest with more people in China, and it needs to invest in knowledge to make sure the management of our bilateral ties reflects our interests and our values. And our position in the world and our ability to achieve our global ambitions rest on our ability to deal with this important relationship. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. I really appreciate the lesson in how to decode the language of the Chinese Congress. Yeah, I'm very excited to introduce our next speaker, and I'd like to also give a plug for her book. I'm almost through it, and Joanna, I love the vignettes of the people that you talk to around the world on this. It really brings to life the story. It's rather than at a 30,000 foot level, basically a personal level. Joanna Chiu is a senior reporter covering national and foreign stories for the Toronto Star and author of China Unbound, A New World Disorder. China Unbound is the winner of the 2022 Writers Trust Shaughnessy Cohen Prize for Political Writing. A regular commentator for international broadcast media, she has been based in Beijing as a foreign correspondent, has reported for the South China Morning Post, The Economist magazine, and the Associated Press. Welcome, Joanna.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I wish I could join in person, but you know, technology makes it possible. I can kind of see my shoulder on the screen. I'm quite big and floating, so kind of strange, but glad to be here with you virtually anyways. I just want to echo some of Phil's last remarks about what we can do to promote better understanding of China. And one of that I always emphasize is simply language. I know, talking to sources and research for my book, that some obstacles for how long Canada took to come up with a coherent and transparent strategy is some lack of China expertise and Chinese language expertise in government. So definitely, I think there's been reshuffling of some roles, and we have people who have lived in China, worked at the embassy, advising the government, working on policy. And I think that's really reliant on being able to have face-to-face conversations with Chinese officials and Chinese people, so that we're not learning about China filtered through translation all the time. So yeah, if you're on the fence about signing up for a Mandarin course or Cantonese course, I would encourage you to give it a shot. And Chinese is hard to learn, but as a journalist graduating from BBC, it took me a long time, but I kind of had to fake it till I made it while I was even in China, in Beijing, living there. Often I would have to do a lot of crash research on vocabulary before heading into interviews. And people in China were really nice and patient and helped me along. So for my presentation, I would like to focus on a little bit more of the background of Canada-China relations, how we got to this point. And then I'm sure a lot of you have seen the pretty extraordinary news of the zero COVID protests in China. The biggest large mass protests on political issues in China since 1989, the Tiananmen protests or Tiananmen related protests calling for reform. So Trudeau's father, Pierre Trudeau, was actually the prime minister to reopen official bilateral relations between Canada and China after a long period, during the Cold War, as the CCP had gained power and had the Chinese Civil War around 1970. So I think I was in Beijing when Trudeau became prime minister, and the kind of messaging from the administration was that they would pursue this free trade agreement with China, between Canada and China. It would be a focus, and a lot of the context was that there was growing instability with the US-Canada relationship, so it made sense for Canada to look to its third largest trading partner to see if those ties could be expanded. Even though China is Canada's third largest partner, the proportion of international trade the two countries have is actually only around 6%, because Canada is so largely reliant on American trade. So Trudeau went, and a lot of his senior ministers went over to Beijing in 2017, had a lot of press conferences, and was really positive and optimistic. But I was, waiting for the meetings to be over, waiting for some sort of statements from both sides. And you can tell that things have not gone as well as Ottawa hoped. Actually, later learned from reporting that it was actually quite a disaster. Trudeau was asking for things like human rights provisions in the trade agreement, for labor rights to be protected. And the Chinese side, felt like that was disrespectful to have all these conditions. And the environment minister team actually had to scramble to come up with a MOU, memorandum of understanding on climate change cooperation, just so they could leave the country after all of this investment and time and sending all of this high profile delegation to China, to come away with some sort of announcement that they were going to commit to working on fighting climate change together. In fact, the foreign minister, Champagne at the time, he last minute was left in China to try to salvage the situation. So I think that what tells us is that Canada's ambitions perhaps wasn't in line with the reality of some of the political circumstances in China at the time. And this was before the whole Meng Wanzhou crisis took off. So after working for 7 years in China as a journalist, mostly for European media, because opportunities for Canadian media were very limited and right now don't exist. After these years of tensions and COVID lockdowns, CBC closed down its bureau in Beijing. So we actually don't have any Canadian media presence in mainland China. The Globe and Mail correspondent is stuck in Hong Kong, covering all of China from Hong Kong. So I left Beijing in late 2018, thinking the China story would be behind me, moving back to Vancouver, where I started working as bureau chief for the Toronto Star's Vancouver office, thinking I could get reacquainted with what's happening in Canada and the stories here. And the next thing I know, Meng Wanzhou, she was arrested in my city's backyard in the Vancouver International Airport. And that touched off, as you all know, the two Michaels, the hostage taking, some tariffs on Canadian goods, just very frosty, intense relations, finally resulted in, after almost 3 years in prison, Meng Wanzhou accepting a DPA, deferred prosecution agreement, admitting some wrongdoing. And there was just a recent piece in Wall Street Journal that really unpacked all the details of what went on behind the scenes that I recommend. And really the US had to step in to negotiate for the release of the two Michaels. It got the country talking about Canada's role when it comes to these tensions, when the US is increasingly direct and confrontational with China, what that means for middle power countries like Canada, what that means when, for example, what happened with Meng, where Canada had arrested her on the request of US authorities, where she would first be able to have the legal right to fight extradition to the US, which she did. She had many lawyers who did so. It really touched off at, and my book talks about this global discussion on what middle powers should do about China, why it's not just up to the superpowers to figure this out, because pretty much every country has a very deep vested interest with China, both on the people to people level and also economic. So China has always sent many, not China like the government, but Chinese people have always been migrating widely and studying in universities around the world, contributing to major industries like science and medicine. And there's many actually Canadians living in China as well as Hong Kong. There's 300,000 Canadian citizens who are also Hong Kong residents and citizens. So I think there's been a belated realization that all countries, no matter what size, need to understand China, this rising superpower, and have its own policies. And in my cross-country comparisons of different middle power Western countries, it really emerged that Canada was quite slow and passive when it came to trying to come up with an approach to these growing tensions and challenges when it comes to Beijing's authoritarian system and growing what they call wolf warrior diplomacy, where Chinese diplomats seem to be kind of performing or sending signals mostly to a domestic audience that they can be tough, that they can stand up for Chinese dignity in the face of growing international criticism. So Canada just released its Indo-Pacific strategy in the last about a week ago. And this strategy was in the works as early as late 2019. Many other countries have already put out policy documents on how they would approach this shift in relations and diplomacy with China, how they would strengthen ties with other countries in Asia, for example. So, and this kind of Indo-Pacific strategy was dogged with controversy right from the beginning. The Globe reported that the initial draft of the strategy did not even mention China at all. And publicly, the committee that consulted on the strategy had a lot of people who were in the business community that had vested interests because their companies were heavily invested in China, had offices in China. So, people who were insiders said that that was the reason why this long-awaited China policy strategy, the draft did not include China at all. And apparently Foreign Minister Melanie Joly, she intervened and made the language a lot tougher. And in her 2 speeches presenting the strategy, China played a big role. She admitted that Canada has not been seen by its Western allies as a reliable partner when it comes to dealing with these, growing difficult issues, such as cybersecurity, cyber attacks coming from China, Beijing's United Front, foreign influence and interference issues, and that they would work with their allies, but also and be more transparent that they do believe that China is a disruptive power, that human rights is an issue, that Taiwan is under threat. At the same time, she also laid out a pretty nuanced approach where she acknowledged that it's not possible to not engage with China, being so containing 1/5 of the world's population, being so critical in existential human efforts, things like fighting climate change. And as we saw during the pandemic, when there were supply chains issues, we realized that even though perhaps Canadians had dollar trade with China might not be as huge as you might expect, even if it's a Canadian company and the good is a Canadian product, somewhere in the supply chain, almost all of the time, involves a Chinese factory. So it's not possible to isolate China. But the Indo-Pacific strategy and other countries have been trying to diversify its reliance on China. Canada has been making kind of efforts to improve our relations with places like Japan and South Korea and India. And India is tricky because India is seen as a flawed democracy where there's increasing human rights concerns for minorities in India. And in fact, the term Indo-Pacific is also a subject of debate because it replaced what we used to call Asia Pacific, that really deliberately puts more of a emphasis on India's place in the region, because India, as a major economy, as well as a very populous place, can, if provided with more support from the West, become a counterweight to some think as China's destabilizing presence in the region, that propping up India is a good way to counter it. So Canada and other places are trying to invest. And in fact, Canada last week announced it would invest 2.3 billion in trying to strengthen Canada's relations with countries in the Indo-Pacific besides China. And she actually warned Canadian businesses that they do business in China at their own risk, that their trade ministry is there to support them, to help them understand the geopolitics of doing business in China, things like the risk of losing their license or policies that might disadvantage foreign firms. But she strongly actually warned Canadian businesses that they continue to do business in China at their own peril. And I spoke with people in the business community, and they felt that while some support and some transparency was welcome, it perhaps didn't capture how for some industries, for example, electronics, consumer electronics, there's simply no alternative to China. There's no viable environment in Asia or any other part of the world that can produce with quality and speed electronics. That's why Apple, despite the pressure to address human rights concerns in its factories in China that are contracted to a Taiwanese company, Foxconn, we've seen protests there in recent months. Apple has no plans to relocate its iPhone and computer manufacturing outside of China. So this is a question that governments will continue to navigate going forward. I am heartened by the fact that there is an acknowledgement that the human expertise on and knowledge on China is lacking. Minister Jolie said she would put more China-focused experts in embassies all over Asia. And we've seen some new appointments of ambassadors across the Asia region, including former head of mission, Jim Nickel in Taiwan, which is a pretty significant place for him to be, someone senior to be. So personally, I do feel optimistic that Canada is putting both investments and investing in human capital into trying to navigate this rocky relationship. But like Phil talked about, Trudeau did try to catch some quick words with Xi Jinping at the G20 in Bali. And part of it was captured by the Canadian press. And it showed Xi Jinping pretty much chastising and talking down and condescending to Trudeau, kind of berating him for telling the press that he did bring up the fact that there's concern about China's foreign interference in Canadian federal elections. It was something that she said that Trudeau should not have talked about openly. And that's, you think about it, and our intelligence agencies says they have evidence, and they briefed senior officials that at least 11 federal candidates received some sort of kind of covert funding from the Chinese state in the 2019 elections. And the response so far has been, you shouldn't have talked about it. So I'm not really sure how productive these conversations will be going forward. I think it's hard to overstate how insulted China was that Canada arrested Meng Wanzhou, she's one of the most well-known entrepreneurs, and her family is so well connected politically. So it's going to be both sides will have very kind of difficult baggage to that's part of the relationship going forward. And that's different from some other countries. Australia, for example, has a new prime minister, and their first meeting in some years between Australia and China was actually quite positive. And I think China can explain to its domestic audience that this is a new leader in Australia. So it's not a continuity from previous leaders that were tough on China, that insulted China. So we'll see how that goes. A lot of it depends on Washington's tack. After the midterm elections, Biden seemed to soften slightly its quite hawkish approach to China, and also Biden and Xi had a meeting. So we will see how that goes. And in the meantime, the issues like foreign interference, intimidation of international critics of China continues to be an issue, meddling in democratic elections. And I think there is really a dearth in research, especially research that's available to the public. We hear that, CSIS has this data, it is briefing Canadian officials, but this is not made public. We don't know which candidates received these illicit donations, for example. In my book, I talked to quite a few people who actually received physical visits from Chinese police, Chinese agents, or phone calls from Chinese officials and police, complaining about basically them exercising their right to free speech to support the Hong Kong protests, for example. And when these people, if they decided to go report these cases to Canadian police and authorities, I've checked in on many of these cases, and they all say that even if the police took a report, there has been no progress made on these investigations. And in some cases, at least in one case, a student in Quebec who was harassed, and his parents back in China were threatened. He actually got laughed out of the police station. The police said it was up to him whether or not to delete this post that the Chinese were angry about, that he had free speech in Canada. So why is this even an issue? Really showing a lack of training on lower levels. And that's part of the issue that Phil talked about, where there's this, I think, an attitude in Canada that when it comes to local level policing or even government, such as city councils, they feel that these broad issues concerning China that are political, that are about human rights, it doesn't concern them, that their main job is to try to advocate for their companies, for their businesses, to leave things like national security and interference to the Fed. And this is an attitude I think that needs to be changed. So just for the last few minutes, I wanted to quickly highlight what we've seen happen in recent days in China, the zero COVID protest, and then I would love to have a conversation with you all and hear your thoughts on what direction, like this crossroads that Phil was talking about, what people of Canada might do to try to make sure that what happens next is something that is favorable to both the Canadian economy and human rights. So as many of you know, the trigger for these massive protests in some 24 Chinese cities, including university campuses, but also major parts of cities like Beijing and Shanghai, was an apartment fire in Urumqi, a city in Xinjiang, a place that is notorious for the repression, internment of Uyghurs and other religious minorities. So people were angry because there were reports that the city was in COVID lockdown for 100 days. And that was a reason why firefighters had difficulty trying to save these people. And people died in these fire, allegedly locked, trapped in their homes. And I think this is a level we haven't seen in the West. When we think about COVID protocols, we may recall some really tough times where businesses were forced to close. People were advised to stay home, to try to work from home if possible, or were laid off. But in China, it's been at a different level where people were told to stay home. Often they're kind of local kind of helpers of the state actually put tape around on the outside of their doors so they couldn't leave, not even for groceries. And people had to rely on the state at different levels to deliver essential goods. A lot of people face, as you can imagine, starvation. Pets died because people weren't able to get pet food for them. And, when it came to choosing between feeding your family and feeding a pet, I think a lot of pets died. So that kind of gives a sense of the situation and really the level of frustration that a lot of people had. Not only were there lockdowns anytime there are cases in a city, an outbreak, but there was a lot of mandatory testing outdoors, regardless if you have any symptoms whatsoever. So people felt that was very disruptive to their life. In the meantime, it's partly also a working conditions and labor rights protest. I mentioned protesting iPhone workers in southern China. They were protesting because they were promised an incentive to go back to work, even in factories which were controversial because they allegedly made people stay in dorm rooms where there were also COVID cases. So it's really a mix of people feeling frustrated that they were suffering, that COVID-0 is not sustainable and that they don't see a path out. Some people I've actually met in Canada who have taken a pretty extreme step of leaving China. And these are people who are working in tech, who are students who don't consider themselves political. But I think people outside China don't really understand how traumatizing some of these COVID-0 lockdowns have been for many people. I have a friend who said her parents in Shanghai were trying to put on a tough face when they were calling her from lockdown, but she knew looking at them that they had lost significant weight. So this is something that I think is a long time coming, but it's also unusual because a lot of Chinese people really know that going out to protests, criticizing state handling, and in some cases even calling for Xi Jinping to step down is very risky. There are so many laws in China that we don't have here in Canada, endangering national security or provoking trouble, that carry sentences, minimum sentences of years. So far, the police haven't been making these mass arrests that they could have been. And actually, to my surprise, this most senior member of government in charge of COVID policies signaled that there might be a relaxing of China's policies on COVID, that they will optimize the response and focus on vaccinating the elderly and things like that. Xi Jinping actually talked to EU president just earlier today, saying that he acknowledges that the protests reflect frustration, especially among students. So this is something that I would see as tentatively a positive sign that Beijing might actually, instead of trying to crack down, arrest a lot of people, which they can because there's surveillance in all these places, that they might really, really slowly ease up on some of their policies on COVID. But it's tricky because China's hospital capacity just isn't enough to be able to deal with a big surge in cases and a huge outbreak, people getting sick, people feeling like they don't have the best vaccines available to them because China is mostly relying on their own domestic vaccines, could also trigger, huge unrest. And lastly, I just also note that former President Jiang Zemin died at the age of 96 this week. And that's also a potential destabilizing force because people are treating him despite his flawed leadership with some nostalgia, a time when China's economy was rising rather than this year when the Chinese leadership did not even release its GDP growth figures, which signals that the economic growth is worse than many economists even predicted. So China's also facing a crossroads. It's facing a really tough time economically and politically, and it's risking losing kind of the trust of the Chinese people, where in the past, before COVID, quite a few international researchers found that the level of public support for the government was fairly high. So looking at the Chinese government, how it's going to navigate this new environment where public trust is probably at the lowest point it's been in some decades will be really interesting to see.
I guess, yeah, Bill, we can get you back up at the front. And maybe we'll start with, I guess, a question from the audience here.
Question about the moving Hu Jintao out of
Oh,
the thing. I've read many different interpretations, and I'd like to hear from someone who, has been watching for longer than the guys I read on podcasts.
Yeah, Phil, if I can get you to repeat the question.
so the question is who raised about Hu Jintao's his removal from the meeting of the Congress meeting. You saw him being escorted out somewhat reluctantly, and so what's that about? What's the interpretation of that? What does that mean? I will start by saying that there are probably 5 people who know exactly what went on there. And those who know aren't talking, and those who say they know don't. I don't think we'll ever know exactly what happened. There are suggestions that he was scarred out because he's going to object to some of the removal of his gang or his faction from leadership, but I don't think we know. Joanna, do you have?
So I didn't quite catch the question.
Oh, sorry. The question was really Hu Jintao's removal from the Congress.
Right. Yeah.
What does that mean?
I think there was, I think it's impossible for us to try to guess what that meant. Everyone has been replaying that scene that he was holding a piece of paper and, people were taking it away from him. What was it? But I think people in the know that there are factions in the Chinese Communist Party that Xi has been purging political opponents or people who could possibly challenge him who are in different what they call cliques in the party. It is way too complicated for me to try to grasp, but there are all of these theories and seeing what happened to Hu, that it reflects some sort of internal squabbling. But I think it's fair to say that there is internal disagreement even after Xi has been able to promote into the Politburo his allies, and with things like the corruption campaign, been able to find ways to purge people who might oppose him. But we shouldn't even assume that the Chinese Communist Party is a monolithic bloc. I know at least the last time I was living in Beijing that people told me that there's a mood where people in politics and academia, senior levels of advising the government, are really worried about saying anything. They're worried about being noticed or stepping out in any way because of this atmosphere of repression.
Yeah,
We're going to go from audience to online and audience to online. So next one's
we've got to
online.
get the online audience a little more active. If you can make a request to type in questions on the Q&A, I can read them out. But I don't see any questions yet. So yeah.
Just a question to you as a diplomat. But how you see
Former diplomat.
Yeah, former. Now Georgia. So how do you see when Harper refused to shake hands with Putin, and now we see Trudeau kind of what happened? You see that Xi was kind of little upset that why we could get what he was not supposed to do. How do you see as a diplomat the behavior of our prime ministers? in that context?
So the question is, how do I see the behavior of both of
Our prime ministers.
our prime ministers with, yeah, as diplomats with respect to, Russia and China, with respect to Stephen Harper's refusal to shake hands with Putin, and then this interaction with Xi Jinping? Well, I can answer. I'm going to answer. Take a broader question too. One of the things I think I'm concerned about is that in Canada, for the last 20 years, there's been this increasing, tendency amongst senior political leaders that we have fewer diplomatic relations with countries where we have troubles with them. So there has been no significant engagement with Russia since I think the early 2000s. Since I think the last time a foreign minister went to Moscow was maybe 2009, so whatever, 2009, 2010. So there's been none of that. And now we're in a situation where, of course, Russia is taking this horrible action against Ukraine, and we have no significant ways of connecting with at leadership level to express our views. Similarly with Iran, if we close down our embassy in Iran, well, really, what's going on in Iran, we really need to understand it better, and to understand it, and also to maybe be able to provide some support for people. With China, again, there hasn't been much engagement for the last while. It's not just Canada's fault. I think China, cut off a lot of ties as well. With this interaction with Xi Jinping, I have to say I'm okay. I'm not saying I'm on Xi Jinping's side on this one, because I'm not. But these interactions you have, in order for diplomacy to work well, there has to be some time when you don't make everything public. And if you're going to deal with difficult questions, and so when they have a more formal bilateral meeting, each side reports what happened, give their interpretation, we have a readout, they talk about this and this. But even in that case, you don't give a lot of detail. And I remember Stephen Harper, in his trips to China, he would raise, and I was in the room, he would raise human rights issues with his counterparts at senior levels. And then reporters would ask, did you raise human rights? And he would say, yes. And then they say, well, what did you say? And what did he say? And Harper's consistent response was, I am not in the habit of discussing my conversations with leaders on these sensitive issues in public. And that was it. And I think it created a better space to have this conversation. You have to be transparent, and Canada has to make statements and has to be, but there's times when you actually have to keep these conversations more closer. And I think in this case, especially an informal stand-up one, where you're raising a tough issue kind of on its own. So in the case of this one, I believe what happened is that Mélanie Joly gave a conference to talk about what happened. Trudeau gave a very brief, kind of like Stephen Harper kind of like response, which was, we talked about this. Joly went into more detail and sort of reiterated how it was unacceptable and how the prime minister said it was unacceptable. I think that's what got under Xi Jinping's skin, because they're not used to people doing it in that way. So, I think it was a bit, there's been at times, these governments have been a bit slipshod in how they handle information in a way that creates a space for a longer term conversation on these tough issues. Did you? Okay. Any questions? Any more online questions? Or?
Still waiting.
Okay.
You can make another.
Joanna, did you want to add to that? We can
Sure.
contradict me.
No, I don't disagree. But someone, I forgot who, kind of made the point that perhaps Trudeau was under pressure to say that he raised something because of, like I spoke about, kind of the lack of response to these issues of foreign interference and harassment of our Chinese Canadian populations over the last few years, when these issues have become more and more covered in the press, where more and more Canadians care about these issues. Some say that Trudeau had to say he brought it up because otherwise Canada would look quite weak in the with the revelation that there was this alleged interference. I did check in with the opposition, the Conservatives, as well as NDP, and they said that they weren't informed even privately who these federal candidates were that received these political donations that were problematic. perhaps they're waiting to do a longer investigation. There will be hearings, but there's a frustration because there is kind of also internal pressure from the parties to act, to do their own due diligence and investigations. And if there is actually an elected official in government that received or perhaps was complicit in receiving these funds, that they should figure it out as soon as possible. So I think Canada, compared to the US, does lack some level of public transparency. There was in a lab, I believe in Winnipeg, and then someone who worked in tech in Quebec arrested for or investigated for alleged spying or assistance in industrial espionage for China. And compared to the US, where I think they have the opposite problem, where people who are charged, not even found guilty, their cases are kind of splashed everywhere, ruining their reputations, careers, when later a lot of these charges were dropped. In Canada, anything that happens in this nature is done in very hush-hush private circumstances, which is understandable. Like Phil said, diplomacy needs some space to be conducted, and also when you don't have a conviction yet, it's hard to bring this to light. But I think some middle ground between what the US approach is, just kind of airing it all out, and the Canadian approach might be more appropriate.
Yeah, I think there's perhaps some sentiment that diplomacy equals approval or something, that having diplomatic relations with a country means that you approve of what's going on. Having an embassy there means that you approve what's going on. And that's just, in fact, when things are tougher is when relationship is bad, is when you actually need more diplomatic engagement.
Okay, we have one question online. Is the Chinese government's interest in addressing wealth inequality in the country a response to international criticisms about conditions for workers, a revived commitment to Marxist principles, criticism of unfettered capitalism, a response to citizen unhappiness, or something else? Do you
want to start, Joanna? Or?
No, you can start, because it's partly about Party Congress.
I don't think it's so much a response to international criticism. I think it's partly, it partly reflects, I think, Xi Jinping's actual belief and approach to how the country should run, that there should be less inequality, that it reflects, I think he's more of a stronger, I think, adherent to some Marxist ideology and Marxist ideas. Joanna mentioned Jiang Zemin, who, the former president who just died, who was much, of the approach that you let people get rich and it bleeds down to the rest of the countryside. If you get some people and some companies in some provinces get rich. And Hu Jintao does, or Xi Jinping doesn't think that way, I don't think. And secondly, though, I think also, stability is very important in China. The Communist Party is, stability is #1 job in keeping themselves in power. And this great gap in income has been always a challenge in China. And I think there's this attempt to look at this because of the income gap is so wide, and because could be a source of instability. I think for a long time there's been a wide and widening income gap in China, but I think from my understanding of it, as long as, even if the income gap was wide, as long as people were sort of all heading in a direction where they thought they'd be more prosperous, it alleviated some of this discontent. But if, as Joanna said, the economic growth is going to be a real challenge for China, then this could then make the income gap as an even stronger source of instability.
Yeah, and I would just quickly add that they may be particularly concerned about the youth unemployment rate, which hit highs of nearly 20% this summer. And young people, when you think about these issues about how there's more men than women in China because of the one child and then the free child policy, and that when you look at on the streets, the videos of the protesters and what Xi Jinping said, a lot of it's young people. So having a 20% youth unemployment rate of people who are already frustrated about other issues like political issues, handling of COVID, that's a big source of instability for the state. This is precisely the group that they want to have stable jobs and to feel like they're being given a good, stable environment to pursue their futures in China.
You had a question?
Yeah, so Joanna, you mentioned that it's not possible to isolate China anymore, and that's very true in terms of the level of integration of China into the global economy and the mutual dependency between China and the West in economic terms, at least. But to what extent, I mean, just looking at this Congress and the new platform that Xi Jinping has put in place, is to what extent is China in some ways trying to isolate itself or make itself more self-sufficient in terms of things like components for, the components you were talking about, right? I mean, does Xi recognize that this is an issue and that China has to be more self-sufficient? And maybe China is trying to isolate itself in that regard.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would say that this kind of thinking is not just restricted to China, but during the pandemic, I think many countries have started to look at the idea of self-sufficiency in terms of essential things like energy, technology as a national security issue, and that it is smart. I was just in Taiwan for a series of stories I did for Toronto Star, and Taiwan as an island actually risked being blockaded from China, that it would be easy, well, relatively easy to block off Taiwan as a relatively small island from the rest of the world. So there's conversations in Taiwan happening about how they need to increase its renewable energy production. China could really bring it to its feet just by cutting off their gas supply from overseas. So in China's case, there is definitely a transparent push to promote self-sufficiency, especially in the tech sector. If you've heard of Made in China 2025, that's a main kind of industrial policy to try to improve, the tech and high tech sectors in China. And some see it as a threat because China, while its factories manufacture the world's goods, a lot of the high tech and designs actually come from Silicon Valley. Things like, Apple. The chips, China doesn't make the world's most advanced chips yet. But it's a complicated dynamic because the US in its latest export controls actually banned international companies. Like basically, if you want to work with the US, you have to not work with China on these highest AI and advanced microchip businesses. So in a way, China right now doesn't have a choice when it comes to high tech because the US regulations are forcing them to try to be reliant because it's putting immense pressure on international companies to stop shipping these parts to China. Some companies have gotten kind of temporary waivers, like TSMC in Taiwan, the world's largest microchip manufacturer. But there's dynamics that's not just China's fault for this kind of almost bifurcation of the world's technologies.
Yeah, and if I get a couple of things. One is the ideology of self-sufficiency is also been something that has been a recurrent in China's policy for decades. Of course, there's under the Maoist sort of we're all going to be self-sufficient Cultural Revolution sort of ideology, and there are those who still subscribe to some aspect of that in terms of believing it. But even in the times when for example, under Jiang Zemin, when there was a much more drive to market-oriented market economy kind of approach, there were still those who were saying, but we have to be self-sufficient in grain. We have to have food self-sufficiency because otherwise we don't know how we're going to survive. And that goes back to China's history of starvation and wanting to make sure that they can get food. But I also think on the other side of this, I think China is quite concerned about its relations with the United States. And self-sufficiency may be partly coming from the idea that if we are going to be, if the world's going to be, if globalization is collapsing and the world's going to evolve into 2 or 3 separate spheres, then we have to be more self-sufficient. But I think there's an undercurrent again of worry about, given the economic ties with the United States, that it's not in China's long-term interest to have these economic problems and these trade barriers, and there should be a way of addressing it. So perhaps the self-sufficiency is a way of kind of hedging their bets about how they can move forward.
Great. Well, we've got 3 questions online. Let me start with one from anonymous attendee. You mentioned signs of instability in Xi's government. How would such factionalism express itself, particularly in this information-saturated age? What are Xi's factional rivals, and how does their vision differ?
Well, okay. I'm not saying right now there are signs of instability. What I think I was trying to say was that this could lead to more instability because when you have one single powerful leader and surrounded by acolytes, that there's bound to be competition, there's bound to be, I think, infighting, and it's bound to make things and a lack of counter thinking or different views to challenge your views makes it inherently unstable. That said, I mean, the whole issue of where are the factions in China, as Joanna said, it's really complicated. The last where there might be sources of opposition to Xi, other factions, and the factions arise because politics in China has always been factional. This isn't new. It's even through the Qing dynasty, there's always these factions, partly because of lack of transparency and lack of rule of law. But anyway, and they can be very deadly competition. I would say right now, the faction that lost out in the party Congress very decisively was Hu Jintao's faction. It was the people that came up through the Communist Youth League. A lot of people connected with that, and so these were the ones who dominated more Chinese politics under former President Hu Jintao. And the other faction that is sort of prominent is the faction of former President Jiang Zemin, who just died, a Shanghai-based faction that really pushes market forces in general, and the kind of economic reforms that we saw advancing very quickly in the 1990s, especially. So those would be the different factions. How you read them, a bit like I said about reading the code in the General Secretary's speech. On economic issues, I think there has tended to be more sort of open debate about it, but it's sort of, what someone says elliptically and it's published, if it's published by a central media organ like the People's Daily, and if the message is slightly different from what Xi Jinping's message is, and if that person isn't from the Xi Jinping kind of group or they're sort of departing it, then you have to sort of ask what exactly they're saying. How is the message different? It takes a lot of really intense kind of observation and knowledge of the vagaries of the policy, but it's the way these messages sometimes get sent.
Yeah, that's a great response from Phil. I would just add that the fact that Jiang Zemin and he was the head of this so-called Shanghai faction that was perhaps the main contender to Xi Jinping's power. His death, some might say that, oh, now this kind of faction will weaken, but some also argue that because there's like kind of a countrywide mourning for him now, it's being encouraged that for the public, and a lot of businesses, everything is in grayscale. A&W screens are in black and white to mourn him. It actually offers an opportunity for people to talk about politics, to talk about and compare a previous leader with the current one. So that right now it's also kind of a precarious time because of this opening and being able to talk and compare.
And in fact, we should be aware that the whole Tiananmen protest started with the death and funeral of former General Secretary Hu Jintao, who was a reformer, who was pushed out for his support or lack of coming down hard enough on earlier demonstrations. And it was this kind of incident that started people gathering. So I'm sure the government's worried about this, and I'm sure they will try to address it. But it's possible, as you say, that this would be a source of potential these discussions and potential unrest.
Just one more question from my side, you being a people forward. So we now know that the countries, they stop the diplomatic relations when we are needed the most. So what is happening underneath? Why they do that? That they need more, and is it a sign of weakness?
Okay.
Or I don't like. I just want.
Yeah. Did you hear the question, Joanna?
Not, I heard if something's a sign of weakness, but I'm not sure. what.
It's about why would countries, when times are toughest in a relationship, why would countries stop diplomatic relations?
And it's needed more.
Pardon me, and
When it's needed more.
when it's needed most, why they stop it, and why is that, and why does that happen? Well, it's usually not the recommendation of officials, I can tell you that. I think what it is because especially because we tend, not just Canada, countries tend to increasingly see their foreign policy driven by domestic interests. And so I think messages like that or decisions like that are often a result to either play to domestic concerns, to show domestically that you're being tough on this country by cutting diplomatic relations, and to send a message to that country that you're very upset about what's going on or what the situation is. So I think that's why they do it. I think they do it not out of a necessarily considered response about the broader need for having to have this engagement. And there's not a lot of sympathy, frankly, publicly, for maintaining, say, diplomatic relations with Iran. It gets a lot of good responses often if you cut off ties with this kind of country. Now, in the case of we haven't cut off diplomatic relations with Russia. And I have to give credit to, Foreign Minister Joly, who has said, look, this is when you need to have these connections. So certainly she understands that it's important to keep these ties going, but sometimes it's just convenient. But other times, yeah. So those are, I think, the reasons why we reduce these contacts.
So basically, it shows a sign of weakness on the part of the party within the government. They're looking at voting interest rather than national interests.
Yeah, I mean, the question is, does it mean it shows weakness on the part of the party in power? I think it shows a focus on domestic interests. Whether it's weakness or not, it's just a focus on what will work best, what will sell best to certain of our constituencies.
Yeah, and I don't have more to add on that point.
All right. Online, thank you both for your presentations. We often talk about Canadian values in relation to foreign affairs and dealing with other countries, including China. My question is, what are these Canadian values? The self-interest of the business sector or the values of free speech and human rights as upheld by average Canadians?
Do you want me to start, or do you want to start, Joanna?
I guess briefly, I would just say that we should also be aware that Canada has some obligations, international treaty obligations for things like monitoring the use of forced labor in our goods. The issue is that a lot of, despite it being bound to these international treaties, there's not a lot of teeth in our regulations to actually enforce it, to actually monitor. For example, my colleague and I just worked on a story on how some major Canadian pension plans are actually investing Canadian pensions in companies that work in Xinjiang or who work and supply surveillance technology to the Chinese military and government. And these are they're just combing the Chinese indexes. So this is a kind of form of passive investment. So these are questions that increasingly more Canadians are asking about, which in the past, when the political environment with China was in a kind of more positive note, focused on opportunities, it flew under the radar. And there's more pressure on companies to actually do more of its internal ethical governance, which there's a precedent for. A lot of companies have their own kind of social, environmental protocols, but what's happening now is I think the general public and media is putting more pressure on these companies to follow through and do a kind of more diligent look into its supply chains. The context is that there's been some reports that, as China said, some of its internment camps for Uyghurs have been shut down, and Uyghurs have graduated from these so-called vocational centers, that they're moving on to work opportunities. But we see some indications that these work opportunities are repressive, that there's not much choice about doing this work, or it's also part of this move by the government to separate families in Xinjiang, to kind of disperse Uyghur people so that they're not all living in Xinjiang, that they're working in factories and companies in Guangdong in the south, far, far away, to kind of try to dilute, and some say attack their ability to maintain their culture, language, religion. So that's a context for, I think, the latest pressures. Yeah, but as far as Canadian companies working in China, when I was in China, a lot of them actually welcomed some kind of awareness and support from the Canadian government that there were increasing challenges of working in China, that it wasn't just, they didn't need just like, support, but actually help navigating sometimes constantly shifting regulations and rules that Chinese companies also have headaches dealing with. But unlike Canadian companies, they are Chinese and they speak Chinese, and they have insiders to help them navigate it. So a lot of businesses in China that are foreign, a lot of them aren't so rosy and optimistic. They acknowledge these challenges, and they actually welcome governments to also see these challenges and help them negotiate them.
Yeah, I think Joanna mentioned obligations. I think that's important. And getting to the issue of forced labor or slave labor, I mean, Canada can just restrict imports of any product of slave labor and be completely in compliance with its international obligations. And that's important for people to know. One of the things about Canadian values, I liked when I did this kind of work internationally, I like to try to find, approach it less in terms of Canadian values and more international values in which that overlap with Canadian values. So if you're going to complain about a human rights practice, I think it's much better if you can refer to a country's international obligations, what they have agreed to do through international law, and then refer to that and say, you've agreed to this, and so we're concerned also as signatories of this agreement that you're not living up to it. And that kind of takes it away from saying you're imposing your values on us, which we would get a lot otherwise. On companies, I think there's I'd be hesitant to also, and Joanna made some really good points about this, and just to build on that, I'm hesitant to sort of say, to ascribe, all Canadian companies have the same values or don't have values when they approach China. There are some that I knew when I was there who saw themselves as using applying Canadian employment practices, which they're supposed to do, as a way, and seeing it as a way of spreading these kinds of more fair practices around the country and implementing them. So I visited factories and manufacturing facilities where safety and employee wealth and employee welfare was part of what they did. So and those are of course part of Canadian values as well.
Probably time for one quick question.
Sure, yeah, quick one, yeah.
Okay.
I wanted to try to connect what's going on in China to Russia a little bit. I think we've sort of been very relieved that to discover that the Russian army is not nearly as strong as everybody thought it was. And the story about that is that it's due to corruption, that the kleptocracy has taken a lot of the money that's supposed to go to the military and kept it to themselves. And I'm just wondering whether we have any insight into whether anything similar is happening in China. Is the PLA similarly undermined by corruption now?
Did you hear that, Joanna? Okay. So I think the question is, if I can paraphrase it, the person referred to the corruption in the Russian army and how it's been undermined by corruption. And the question was, does the PLA face the same problems? Is corruption undermining its effectiveness? And I'm going to ask you to lead off on that, because I think you're much more recently in China and much more connected to these questions.
Yeah, I mean, when I first started working in China or making trips in like 2012, like it was almost like a comedic relief for journalists to cover gratuitous cases of official corruption. I remember writing about these officials dining on a giant rare salamander, and officials being found embezzling so much money in their homes that it was just stacked everywhere. Definitely one of the reasons behind Xi Jinping's relative popularity among the public, according to things like Pew Research polls, is that he, upon taking office, conducted this sweeping anti-corruption campaign. He called it tigers and flies. So it doesn't matter how low level corruption exists, that they would stamp it out. And I think a lot of that was actually genuine. It wasn't just a political struggle and an excuse or political purge. As far as the military in China, I don't have insights on what level of corruption there is there. I think actually, at least the direction the military is that China is trying to reduce its number of soldiers and instead focus on having more advanced military technology, which is in line with other countries. And they, at military periods, they really like kind of showcase its latest technology. So that might be partly also a way to reduce reliance on military personnel when it's more about the technology. So yeah, but there hasn't been any high profile cases where corruption seems to be undermining China's ability to exercise its power, including in the military that I know of.
I have nothing to add. That was a great answer. Shai?
Yeah, I then pass it on to Gary.
Sure. Well, thank you so much, Phil and Joanna, for your sharing your expertise and your knowledge and your experience in China. That was a really engaging discussion and presentation. So let's have a round of applause for our speakers. So as I mentioned earlier, this is the last Global Friday for the fall semester. So thank you to all of you who've been coming throughout the semester. And we will resume on January 13th. I don't have a title, but we will have a Global Friday on January 13th. So that's the next one. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Friday the 13th. It's always a good one. Thank you, Joanna.
Thank you. I'm on Twitter if anyone wants to reach out and chat further. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
That was great. Oh, really good.